Okay, welcome everyone to the PIER seminar. Today we are honored to have Daniel Rees with us. Daniel is currently the head of Central Bank Cooperation at the BIS. Prior to this role, he served as advisor to the general manager and worked as principal economist in the macroeconomic analysis unit of the monetary economics department, and his research spans a range of topics in international macroeconomics, structural change, and applied macroeconomics modeling. Before joining the BIS, he worked at the Reserve Bank of Australia, and where he served as head of macroeconomic modeling. Daniel holds a PhD in economics from MIT. So, okay, Daniel, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much for the kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation to speak here at the Bank of Thailand. I'm very honored to be here, and I'm very excited to talk about the material I'll be going through today. So originally, I was planning to use this time to talk through the BIS Multisector model, which is a new model that we built at the BIS that we're quite excited about, that we think might be of use and interest to other central banks. And so we're going around where we're discussing the model with other central banks and trying to see if there might be other use cases. But as I was preparing for this trip, we were also using the model internally to look at the effects of oil supply shocks. And it turned out that this is actually we think a really nice application of the model. And given that I know there's quite a diverse audience here, some people who are very familiar with macroeconomic modeling, people who do it every day, some people who maybe are sort of users of models, but not necessarily in the development side. I thought just presenting a model presentation might be a little bit dry. So what I'm going to do is spend the first part of the presentation giving you a very high-level overview of the BIS multi-sector model, but then I'll spend most of my time talking through the application to oil supply shocks. Okay, so first of all, I'll start off with the model itself. And this material is based on a working paper that I published with a number of co-authors last year. You can find it on the BIS website, and alongside the working paper, you can also find a toolbox so you can download the model yourself. There's a fairly comprehensive README file, and you can play around with it. You can run it for many countries. You can see how various scenarios look for Thailand. You can do a lot of cool things with it. The model itself, though, is one that we've actually been using internally for a number of years. We first built it during COVID, where, if you remember, there was a series of shocks, of lockdowns and so on, that affected different industries in various different ways. And at this time, we thought it would be useful to have a model that could really look at this different industry structure, could look at shocks that affect the manufacturing industry, very different to the agriculture industry, very different to different services industries. And as we built this and used this a lot internally for our policy work, we thought maybe this is a model that central banks themselves might find useful. Now, to be clear, we know that no central bank would use this as your core model. You need, really detailed models of the Thai economy that has all of your institutional knowledge embedded in it. But there might be specific questions where it's useful to have a model that can really go disaggregated into different sectors. And having a model that has all the code available, that can be pulled off the shelf, that can be run very easily, that has good documentation, that can be calibrated for the Thai economy as a backup for specific questions might be something that you guys are interested in. So that's why we put this model out publicly. The code is available. If people use it and they have questions, they want advice, they want to work with us on projects, we're very happy to, to work with central banks to make this a usable model for them. So what is it? Let me just go through in a high level sort of the features. The first thing is it's a quantitative new Keynesian model with a multi-sector structure. So what does that mean? Well, we start off with sort of a very standard medium scale Smets and Valdez type new Keynesian models. There's optimizing households, optimizing firms. There's a variety of rigidities, both on the nominal side and on the real side. So the basis of the model is very standard. Then we combine that sort of very standard shell with a very detailed multi-sector structure. And I'll explain later exactly sort of what that means. But intuitively, on the production side of the economy, as well as producing using labor and capital, you produce using intermediate inputs from all of the other industries in the economy. So the manufacturing sector uses raw materials, it uses management services, it uses construction goods, it uses administrative services, it uses, outputs of all other industries in the production of manufacturing goods. And then the same applies to other sectors. That's on the production side. On the demand side, when consumers purchase, they don't only purchase a consumption good, they purchase manufacturing goods, they purchase transport goods, they purchase services. So there's a detailed disaggregation on the demand side of the economy. And on labor supply as well. Workers supply labor to different industries. And there's imperfect substitution between all of these things. Okay, so that's the basic structure of the model. It can then be calibrated using input-output tables for many sectors and many countries. So here's the basic industry structure of the model when you download it off our website. So you can see there's many industries there, a lot of detail on the services sector, maybe a little bit less on the real sector. The key thing, though, is that it's incredibly easy to modify the code for different input-output tables. So if you have a specific input-output table for Thailand, probably from the statistical agency that you like to use, to adjust the model to account for that input-output table is like a couple of hours work. It's not a week, it's a couple of hours. So, or if you don't like this group of sectors, you think services sectors all look the same, we want a lot of detail on the manufacturing sector, again, it's very, very easy to modify the model for a different sectoral structure. And in terms of countries, in the toolbox that we have, it can be calibrated to more than 80 countries. I've listed many of them here. The key one, I guess, for this audience is Thailand is there. But if, for example, you wanted to use the model to look at the effect of shocks on the ASEAN region or something, that would also be quite feasible. And again, changing the model to look at different economies is literally a case of just typing in the code of the countries that you want to look at. So it's very flexible. Then in terms of what else we can do with the model, well, we can look at both aggregate and sectoral shocks. The code itself is very easily adaptable. So if you don't like the monetary policy rule that we've put in, you think Thailand has a different one, it's very easy to change the model. And can look at both temporary shocks and permanent structural changes. So for example, if you have the introduction of tariffs and you think that might be permanent and that might change the structure of the economy in a way that looks different to just a temporary shock, you can adjust the model for that. And like I said, it comes with a toolbox that can be easily adapted to different countries, different features, changing the model equations, and so on is very flexible. Finally, the model that you can download off the website now is a closed economy model. We've recently built a small open economy extension, and I think for a lot of countries like Thailand or many countries in the region, you really want to have the open economy dimension. The application that I'll show today uses a small open economy version, and that one will be on our website very soon. But for now, it's just the closed economy. Okay, final thing before I move on to the application to oil price shocks is, okay, we have this multi-sector structure. We have all these different countries. Does it actually matter? Well, here is one example that I think indicates that the sectoral structure does matter. So here I've got the model calibrated for the United States in blue and Korea in red. I use Korea because I was in Korea on Friday. In this exercise, I've run a total factor productivity shock in the manufacturing sector through both economies. So it's the same shock, the same size. The only thing that's different here is the industrial structure of Korea looks very different from the industrial structure of the United States. And you can see that as a result of that, the effect of the manufacturing productivity shock looks very different. GDP in Korea rises about 5 times as much. Exports respond much more, and interest rates as a result respond in a different way. And this is because the Korean economy has a much larger manufacturing sector relative to its entire size than the United States. So again, the specific application doesn't really matter, but the key thing to note is that the sectoral structure of the economy does matter for the quantitative results that you get. Exactly. So the sectoral structure goes through all aspects of the economy. So if there are 18 sectors in the inputs, there's 18 production functions. So you have 18 lots of output and value added. When consumers consume, they consume the goods of 18 industries. The same for investment, the same for government spending, the same for exports and everything else. And then we aggregate it to GDP. Exactly. Exactly.
Does your model apply the I/O table by incorporating intermediate inputs as a part of the production function, unlike the standard DSGE models that typically include only primary factors, labor and capital?
That's exactly right. So I didn't want to go through all of the equations, but if you look at the production function in the model, they produce using capital, labor, and intermediate inputs. And intermediate inputs are themselves an aggregate of intermediate inputs sourced from all of the other industries in the model.
Oh, yes. So would it be fair to say that your model is essentially a forward-looking intertemporal CGE model?
Yes. Crucially, you've got the forward-looking intertemporal part in there. So it's got the full kind of new Keynesian structure in it, where you've got optimizing consumers and firms. You've got stickiness, so you've got the intertemporal rigidities there. But kind of on the IO side, it looks a lot like a CGE model. Exactly.
Yes, and is your model is a general equilibrium model or partial?
It's general equilibrium.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, so now I'll turn to the oil supply application. Now, as you're all aware, since February this year, there's been a very large increase in global oil prices. And the motivation for this work comes from this graph here. So here we have the revision to consensus forecasts of inflation and GDP growth for 2026. And this is the revision between April and February this year. So February was done before oil prices rose, April after oil prices rose, incorporating sort of all the information that's come out since then. I'm aware more's happened than just oil prices. There's been gas prices, there's been fertilizer and so on. but we'll focus here on oil prices. Each dot is the revision for an individual country. I haven't labeled the countries because that's not really important for this. Two things to note. I mean, this is a common shock. Oil prices are essentially a global market. I know there's some variation in benchmark prices, but basically oil prices have risen everywhere. But when we look at the revision to the forecast, they're very heterogeneous. Inflation forecasts have been revised up everywhere, but in some countries it's like 1.5 percentage points. In other countries, it's closer to 0. Similarly, the growth forecast revisions on the vertical axis, they were mostly negative, but for a few countries they were positive. And again, the magnitudes are very different, from plus 0.2 to minus 0.8. So common shock, large cross-country heterogeneity. So given this, we ask 3 questions. The first, quantitatively, how do the effects of oil price shocks vary across countries? Secondly, we ask what explains these differences. Could it be changes in industrial structure, the kind of industries that you have in your economy or the size of them? Could it be the importance of oil in your consumption basket? Could it be whether you're an oil producer or an oil consumer? Or some combination of all of these things. And then finally, we ask, what does this mean for monetary policy? Now, this is very preliminary work, I should caveat. So I'm going to have quite a bit to say about the first 2, although still a little bit of work is going to be required, and I'll highlight in the presentation where that is. And I'll have a little bit less to say about the third bullet. Okay, in terms of how we do this, we use the model that I described before. We calibrate it to match IO tables. I'll show you the industry structure and the group of countries in a moment. And then we simulate the effects of an oil price shock, crucially assuming that every country has the same monetary policy rule. We know that's not literally the case, but we want to sort of isolate the effects of industrial structure sort of without contaminating it with the effects of monetary policy. In terms of the answers that we get, the effects of oil supply shocks on inflation and output vary substantially across countries. Industrial structure matters, mainly for the response of GDP growth. The weight of oil and petroleum in your consumption basket matters primarily for the response of inflation. And whether you're a net oil importer or net oil exporter matters, and that primarily affects the trade-offs that monetary policy faces. And in general, net oil importers face larger trade-offs than net oil exporters. Okay, so here's the roadmap of how I'm going to go through this. The model, as I mentioned before, is we think a great model, but it's really big. And the thing about having a very large model is it can be difficult to get the intuition for why the model is responding in certain ways. So to give you some intuition, I'm going to spend quite a bit of time going through a much simpler model, where the intuition is clear, where I can show the results diagrammatically. All the intuition and mechanisms that I describe in the small model will then go through to the larger model. So I'll briefly present you the full model, show you the results, and then look at the effects of monetary policy in the large model. So we'll start off with the smaller version. This is essentially 2-sector small open economy model. There's 3 goods in the model. There's oil, which is a homogeneous good that can be freely traded across countries. There's domestically produced non-oil goods, and there's non-oil goods produced overseas. Oil is both a factor of production and it's consumed directly. To make the model analytically tractable, I'm going to assume that there are flexible prices in the model, but sticky wages. I'm also going to get rid of all financial markets both domestically and abroad. That means that I can collapse the model into a single period. It also means that there's foreign trade, but each period the trade balance has to balance. So the value of your exports has to equal the value of your imports. In the large model, I'm going to relax all of these assumptions, but this just makes it a bit easier to understand what's going on. And I'll assume there's complete exchange rate pass-through. So changes in exchange rates affect import and export prices one for one. Let me go through the environment. We assume that at period -1, the economies or the global economy is in equilibrium, all prices equal 1, all trade is balanced. At time equals 0, the world economy experiences an oil supply shock that's going to raise oil prices. All prices in the model are flexible, but wages are predetermined, and will normalize the domestic economy's wage W0 equal to 1. Then we assume at the next period, T equals 1, the oil supply shock goes away, all prices and wages are flexible, the economy goes back to its equilibrium. In other words, we can focus all of our attention on that period 0 there. I'll walk you through the foreign economy, then I'll walk you through the domestic economy. We have a small open economy setup, so the large economy and the foreign economy can affect the domestic economy, but not the other way around. And for the foreign economy, we have 3 exogenous variables. We have, and let's let these stars denote foreign variables. We have foreign output, we have the foreign oil price, PO, and we have the foreign good price, PF. So that's the price of the foreign non-oil good. Let's assume that foreign firms produce output using oil and other factors of production. And just to make the algebra a bit easier, let's assume that the foreign central bank stabilizes all of the non-oil prices. So we can normalize all of those to 1. So the price of the foreign good is just going to be the price of oil, which we'll allow to move around. If there's an adverse oil supply shock, P star O will rise. And it's that to this power here, alpha star, where alpha star is the weight of oil in the foreign production function. So the central bank allows oil prices to flow through directly into consumer prices, but stops any other prices from moving. On the domestic side, we have both production and we have consumption. On the production side, the domestic economy receives an oil endowment of Y0. So if you're Saudi Arabia, your oil endowment is really large. If you're Thailand or Australia or Korea, your oil endowment is pretty small. Then the non-oil firms produce output using oil, we'll call that MD, the domestic demand for oil in production, and labor, ND. And alpha and 1 minus alpha is the share of oil and labor in the production of domestic output. Note that alpha here can be different to the alpha star abroad. Now recall that domestic wages are normalized and fixed to 1. That means the price of the domestic non-oil good, PD0, will just be equal to the domestic price of oil, PO, to the weight of oil in the production function alpha. And given that oil is homogeneous, can be traded, that's going to be equal to the foreign price of oil times E0, the nominal exchange rate, to the power of alpha. On the consumption side, there's no investment in this model. On the consumption side, domestic consumers consume oil, CO, non-oil domestic goods, CD, and foreign produced goods, CF. and the omegas are the weights of these three goods in the domestic consumption bundle. And we'll assume that the omegas sum to 1. Given this consumption bundle, the consumer price index is the domestic price of oil, the domestic price of domestic goods, the domestic price of foreign goods, and a geometric average of that. And you could think of omega O here as being the direct effect of oil prices on domestic prices, and this omega D and omega F being the indirect effect. I won't sort of bore you with all the maths, but again, given our assumptions, there's an expression for the consumer price index, which is the price of oil and the exchange rate. So you can see we have oil as a production input, oil as a consumption input, and oil prices affect domestic prices directly and indirectly through the production structure. Yes.
The oil price only affect the domestic price through the production cost. Do you have Philip curves, like it could affect the expectations or wages?
So in the simple model, so I've switched off the wage and the intertemporal components. So that's not there. That'll be there in the full model. But for this, I've kind of shut off these demand and intertemporal effects. Yeah. Okay, there are a bunch of other equations to close the model: trade balance, foreign demand, market clearing, and so on. I won't go through the algebra. Just be aware that they're there. The one thing that I've missed is monetary policy. Now, there's nothing intertemporal in this model. There's no asset trade. So in a sense, there's no interest rates. Instead, I'm going to assume that monetary policy just works by fixing the nominal exchange rate. One could motivate this by putting money in the model and having different money supply rules and so on. The algebra comes out the same. So I'm just going to say monetary policy here just pins down the exchange rate. And what does the exchange rate do? Well, it affects relative prices. It's also, through relative prices, going to affect quantities, the demand for domestic and foreign goods. And as well as affecting kind of these real things, relative prices and quantities, it's also going to affect inflation. Because if we go back to the consumer price index, the exchange rate enters directly there. Intuitively, the central bank can lower the effect of higher oil prices on the domestic economy through tighter monetary policy that strengthens the exchange rate.
So what variable help you achieve the zero trade balance?
Domestic demand. So there's the exchange rate will affect domestic incomes, and the amount you import will vary given your income to make the trade balance hold. So consumers have a budget constraint, and that budget constraint will imply that the trade balance holds. Okay, now the central bank can pick in the model whatever exchange rate it likes. I'm going to consider 3 different policy rules. The first rule is that they pick an exchange rate that ensures that the labour market clears. The second rule is they pick an exchange rate to stabilise the consumer price index. The third rule is that they pick an exchange rate to stabilise non-oil CPI. I'll go through this in a little bit of detail, but intuitively these are 3 common recommendations for how the central bank should respond to oil price shocks. First one is to close the output gap. Second is to stabilise inflation. The third is to prevent second round effects of higher oil prices. In terms of the first closure, if wages are flexible, then labour demand always equals labour supply. But I've assumed in this model that domestic wages are fixed. So that means that labour employed in the economy is determined by labour demand. Workers may want to work more than that or less than that. That's too bad. There is, however, one specific exchange rate for which labour demand exactly equals labour supply. And so this first monetary policy rule is the central bank picks whatever exchange rate is required to make that hold. And intuitively, this will replicate the flexible price, flexible wage allocation. You could think of this as being closing the output gap. Note that in this model, in the face of supply shocks, that may not lead to zero inflation. In fact, generally it won't. So you could have a lot of inflation or disinflation, but still have the output gap closing. The second policy rule stabilizes consumer price inflation. If we recall, this was our equation for the CPI. You can just pick the exchange rate that will cause PC to equal 1, which turns out to be this thing here. Again, I won't go through the algebra, but there is an exchange rate that will cause these two sides to cancel out. And finally, if we define the non-oil CPI as the elements of the consumer basket other than oil, there will also be an exchange rate that stabilizes this quantity here. Generally, with a higher oil price, this will be a higher exchange rate, a weaker exchange rate than the one that stabilizes consumer price inflation. Okay, so what are the mechanisms through which the exchange rate matters? There's four main ones. Yes.
I think you mentioned that you have 3 sectors in here. Do each sector has its own relative interest rate or exchange rate?
No, there's one exchange rate that applies to all the goods. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, so how are oil prices going to matter in this model? The first is through the relative oil intensity of production domestically and abroad. So here I've got the expression for the domestic price relative to the foreign price. That depends on the exchange rate. It depends on the oil price. And here we have alpha minus alpha star. Remember, alpha is the weight of oil in the domestic production function. Alpha star is the weight of oil in the foreign production function. Intuitively, if alpha is greater than alpha star, domestic production is more oil intensive than foreign production. So holding the exchange rate fixed, a higher oil price will raise domestic prices relative to foreign prices, which will lower demand for domestic goods. The second mechanism is that oil appears directly in the consumption basket. So if omega O is higher, then an increase in oil prices will have a larger direct effect on domestic consumer prices and will lead to a larger gap between stabilizing headline CPI and stabilizing non-oil CPI. And this will turn out to worsen your output inflation trade-off after oil price shocks. The third mechanism is how much oil you produce. If you're an oil exporter, then higher oil prices are going to raise your domestic income. That's going to allow you to consume more foreign goods for a given production of domestic goods. And the opposite is going to happen if you're a net oil importer. And the final mechanism is foreign demand. If oil prices rise in general, foreign demand is likely to fall. That'll lower demand for your exports. And again, through the trade balance condition is going to affect domestic quantities and labour market clearing. Before I go on, let me just pause for a second and just check if there are any other questions about the small model. At the back.
Sorry, this might be a bit more detail on the equations in your model. So I checked the on the appendix, I guess. I see that you have like at least the two-stage production function in the firms. But from the first stage, what is your objective function of the firms? Because you have like probably more complicated deriving of the labor and capital, and then you have an intermediate goods. So I just wanted to know that how do you have marginal cost equations and all that in the model? Do you have?
Yeah, okay, so this applies to the larger model rather than the smaller model. Maybe I can come to that when I go through the production function of the large model in about 5 slides time. I'll answer your question then.
Sure. I think.
Super, thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so the last thing I want to do before I go to the large model is just explain diagrammatically how this model is going to solve. And this is going to give us some intuition for the trade-offs that are going to apply in the larger model. The diagram that I'm going to use is a modified Salter-Swan model. Now, in a traditional Salter-Swan model, there's 2 equations. There's an external balance equation, that is all the combinations of domestic output and the exchange rate that will allow the trade balance to hold. And there's an internal balance equation, that is all the combinations of output and the exchange rate for which labour demand equals labour supply. As I mentioned before, with sticky wages, that second equation, the internal balance curve, doesn't need to hold. So I'm going to add 2 more curves, one which is the level of the exchange rate that delivers consumer price stability, and one the level of the exchange rate that delivers non-oil consumer price stability. And depending which monetary policy rule the central bank uses, you'll be on one of those bottom 3 curves. So let me explain what the curves look like. On this graph, I have domestic output on the horizontal axis and the nominal exchange rate on the vertical axis. And the exchange rate is scaled so that an increase in the exchange rate is a depreciation and a decrease in the exchange rate is an appreciation. The external balance curve slopes upwards because intuitively, if domestic output is larger, consumers are going to consume more imports. So in order to deliver a balanced trade balance, you need a weaker exchange rate. The weaker exchange rate will lower the amount of imports you buy, increase the amount of exports. So the external balance curve slopes up. In contrast, the internal balance curve slopes down. If you have a larger volume of domestic production, domestic firms are going to demand more labour. In order to induce workers to supply more labour, you need a stronger exchange rate. The exchange rate has to be lower because a lower exchange rate increases your real wages. It increases your nominal wage relative to consumer prices because remember, it lowers the price of imports, and that will induce you to supply more labour. So external balance slopes up, internal balance slopes down. And then, as I mentioned, we have 2 additional curves, one for the consumer price index being flat, one for the non-oil consumer price index being flat. Diagrammatically, for ease, let me just assume that in the initial equilibrium, everything connects at the same point. So we have an initial equilibrium here. Now we're going to look at how changes in oil prices affect these 4 curves. We'll start off with the external balance curve. Let's say that oil prices rise, and let's say that alpha is greater than alpha star. So your domestic production is more oil intensive. Well, that's going to shift your external balance curve up because remember, when your production is oil intensive and oil prices rise, your production costs increase. So your goods are going to become less competitive. Domestic consumers want to buy less of them. Your consumers want to buy more imports. You need a weaker exchange rate. E has to rise in order to restore the trade balance. And the opposite occurs if alpha is less than alpha star. Second channel is the oil revenue channel. If you're an oil exporter and oil prices rise, the external balance curve shifts down. And that's because a rise in oil prices gives your consumers more income. For a given domestic production, you can afford to buy more imports. That'll lead to a trade surplus. You need a stronger exchange rate. E has to go down to reduce the competitiveness of domestic goods and restore the trade balance. Foreign demand channel goes the other way. The external balance curve is going to shift left. Foreigners, for a given exchange rate, buy less of your exports. You need a weaker exchange rate. E has to go up. Moving on to the internal balance condition. Higher oil prices shift the internal balance curve inwards. The intuition for that is that when oil prices rise, domestic real wages go down, workers want to supply less labour, so you need the internal balance curve to shift in so the labour demand falls to meet labour supply. Finally, the two inflation curves. Higher oil prices are going to lower both the consumer price and non-oil consumer price to stability conditions. Essentially, you need the exchange rate to appreciate in order to offset the rise in oil prices. And the consumer price curve will fall more than the non-oil consumer price curve. Intuitively, to stabilize consumer prices as a whole, you need tighter monetary policy than if you just want to stabilize the second round effects. So now let's look at how these curves are going to move in two cases. One case when you have an economy that's really oil intensive, that imports oil, and then a case when you have an economy that's not very oil intensive, that exports oil. So when you have an oil intensive importer, higher oil prices are going to shift your external balance curve to the left. You're going to go from EB to EB naught. We know that higher oil prices shift your internal balance curve to the left as well. So the position where external balance and internal balance align are going to shift inwards like this. The exchange rate might be higher or lower than it started. That depends how much the relative movement in the two curves, but for sure you're going to be moving leftwards. And then, as I mentioned before, higher oil prices lower the two curves for consumer price and non-oil consumer price stability. Now let's look at the non-oil intensive exporter. For the internal balance curve and the two consumer price or the two inflation curves, they're going to move in a similar direction to what they did before. We know internal balance goes in, the two consumer price curves go down. But now the external balance curve isn't going to move left, it's going to move right. You're getting extra income, your wealth is greater, you can consume more. What you can see from this is that the trade-off between stabilizing the output gap and stabilizing inflation, whether it's consumer price inflation or non-oil consumer price inflation, is going to be better for the oil exporter than it is for the oil importer. In other words, they're going to face a smaller trade-off from oil shocks than the oil exporters do. Okay. So key takeaways from the small model. Oil shocks are most stagflationary when you're an oil-intensive domestic producer, when oil has a big weight in your consumer basket, when you're an oil importer, and when the rest of the world is heavily responsive to oil shocks. Before I move on to the large model, let me just check if there are any questions about the small model results. Yes.
Yeah, can you explain the shift in the IB curve again? Because when the oil prices increase, I would have thought that it would be the negative impact on the economy, economic activity, and then the weaker exchange rates are required to clear the internal balance gap.
Yeah. So the key thing here is the effect on labor supply. So when oil prices rise, the consumer price goes up, and with your nominal wage fixed, that's going to lower your real wage. So when real wages go up, labor supply falls. So you need labor demand to fall to clear the labor market.
Okay, so there's no first order impact on the labor demand then.
You can go around it the other way. You can say when oil prices rise, if oil prices rise and as a result of that, demand for domestic output falls, so your labor demand will fall. You need your labor supply to fall as well to increase the domestic demand, and that's going to give you the exchange rate change. So you can do it from either direction. I think it's a bit more intuitive to start with labor supply and go to labor demand. But it's an equilibrium condition, so both sides have to hold. Yep. But I would agree, the movement in the external balance curve is much more intuitive than the internal balance one. Yep. Okay, now we're going to move on to the full model. All of the intuition from the small model is still going to hold in the large one, but we've got some additional features. We've got price and wage stickiness, and we're going to have financial markets, which means there's an intertemporal dimension as well that wasn't there in the small model. And I'll explain at the end of the presentation why that intertemporal dimension is and is not important. Okay. We're going to do this exercise for about 40 countries. I didn't do it for the full 80. I've sort of got 41 pretty large economies here. I didn't run it for very small economies. Here's the industry structure that we use in the model. For this exercise, we modified it a little bit from the basic model, basically because we wanted a little bit more granularity on the oil sector. So we separate out the production of oil from the production of petroleum products, from refining. And that's because there are some economies where these things are quite different. There are oil producers that don't refine a lot of oil. There are big oil refiners that don't produce a lot of oil. And we wanted to sort of capture those differences. Now, let me explain how oil prices into the model in a bit of granularity. And this will also answer a little bit the question that I had before about the two-stage production structure. So here I have a stylized input-output table. So in reality, I've got 18 industries there. There's a lot more detail. Here I've got an input-output table with made-up numbers for just 3 sectors: oil, manufacturing, and services. The rows show how the production of different sectors is used in the economy. So, for example, oil is used as an input into the oil sector, the manufacturing sector, the services sector. It's consumed directly. It's used as an investment good. It's used in government spending. The columns show what's required to produce the economy's output. So the oil sector uses oil, uses manufacturing services, uses other services, uses labor, and uses capital to produce oil. Now, in terms of the two-stage production setup, how it works is, first of all, firms decide how much of the combination of labor and capital and intermediate inputs they want to use. And then in the second stage, given they want a certain amount of value added, they decide how much labor and how much capital to buy. And similarly, given they want a certain amount of intermediate inputs, they decide how much of each intermediate input to buy. Now you could do this differently. You could set up the production function with just everything in there, or you could set up sort of more stages in the production function. What really matters is how substitutable the different things are. Between wages and capital, but there's very little substitutability between intermediate goods. So I can replace all the computers in the Bank of Thailand by just throwing lots of people at the problem, but I can't really replace the computers with administrative services. Or I can't replace oil with agricultural products. So that's why we break it down in that way. Okay, so how does oil enter? Oil is an input into the production of other industries. So that's, for example, this row here. And it's not very substitutable. So you can't replace oil with other goods very easily. So higher oil prices are going to raise the prices of other industries in the economy. Oil is also directly consumed, at least refined oil. So petroleum enters the consumer basket. It can also be exported and imported. I haven't got it on the IO table here because it's simple, but in reality, in the model, oil is also a traded good. And then finally, oil is produced using other intermediate inputs, using labor and capital. But empirically, oil supply is very inelastic in the short run. When oil prices change, oil output doesn't change very much at all. So there's a lot of rigidity in that sector. So changes in oil prices aren't going to have a large effect on oil production. Okay, in terms of how we parameterize the model, we calibrate it to the input-output tables of each individual country. So we exactly match the input-output table of the US, of Thailand, of Colombia, of everybody else. The other parameters, things like the habits parameter, the Phillips curve slopes, and so on, are common to all countries, and we base that on estimates on the literature. What we still have to do is, I think, is trying to make sure our estimates align with empirical estimates at the country level of the effects of oil supply shocks, but that's still to come. So I think the relative magnitudes across countries from this exercise are going to be right, but I think we might be a little bit off on the aggregate effects. But I think we'll fix that up in the next version. Okay, let's look at some results. Here we have a 10%, an oil supply shock that leads to a temporary 10% rise in the global price of oil. And I've plotted here on the left the response of world inflation, and on the right, the response of world GDP. So this isn't country level, this is the global responses. The key thing here is in the dashed lines, I've plotted estimates from the April IMF World Economic Outlook of the effects on global GDP and global inflation of a 10% rise in oil prices. The key thing here is, look, the blue lines correspond pretty closely to these grey dashed lines. So at a global level, it looks like the elasticities that come out of our model align with what people typically use. So that gives us a bit of confidence in the calibration that we've chosen. I think at the country level, we're a little bit off, but at the global level, we get it right. Can I just check, do I have 5 minutes or do I have a bit longer? Okay. You can give me 10, I can get through it. Okay, let me go very quickly then. Here are country level responses. Lots of lines. Let me just highlight two of them. Blue and red, Korea and Thailand. Korea, I was in Korea on Friday. I'm here in Thailand today. Both of these countries are countries that at a global level have quite large manufacturing sectors and quite small. Thailand has a bigger services sector than Korea, but they're quite manufacturing intensive. And we can see that, and they're both oil importers. So these are countries where the effects on inflation are relatively high, as are the effects on GDP. So they're countries that are quite heavily affected by higher oil prices. Here I have results for some other countries. Key one to note, the green one is Canada, which is an oil exporter. The inflationary effects and the output effects for Canada are much smaller than they were for the more manufacturing intensive countries. So a lot of cross-country variation, and I think quite intuitive. Okay, interest of time, let me go straight to the mechanisms. So we're going to look at some things that could drive the cross-country differences. Four candidates are how much oil appears in the consumption basket. Number four, whether you're an oil exporter or importer. All these two in the middle. The first one is how heavily you consume oil, both directly and indirectly through second and third and fourth round effects. Intuitively, you might not consume oil a lot directly, but you might consume goods that have a lot of oil in the production of them. The third one there is the oil intensity of your overall production. So again, you might use a lot of oil in the production of goods and services, even if you don't sort of produce oil yourself. So this is like, do you have an industrial base that relies a lot on oil, or do you not? Okay, in the interest of time, I won't go through how I calculate these things, but essentially by looking at the entire input-output table, you can trace through the direct second round, third round, fourth round, and so on effects, and calculate how important oil is in the industry. Let me go through a couple of graphs. Here I have on the vertical axis the peak effect on inflation of the oil supply shock. So this is how much that the maximum by which inflation rises. Each dot is a country, and I have three different measures of the importance of oil in the economy. First is the direct consumption weight, how much you directly consume oil. The second is this consumption influence weight, how much do you consume oil directly and as a second round, third round, fourth round. And finally, how important is oil in your overall production structure? So consumption, investment, and government spending. In all cases, the line slopes upwards. So if you're more reliant on oil, you have a higher inflation effect, but the line is closest for the direct consumption weight. In other words, what matters for the inflationary effects of oil supply shocks seems to be primarily how much you directly consume oil. In this case, I break it down by oil exporters in red, oil exporters in blue, oil importers in red. You can see, first of all, you get a closer fit, and also the oil exporters, the effects of oil price, the oil importers, the effects of oil price shocks are more inflationary. Here we do the same exercise, but instead of inflation, on the vertical axis, we have the peak or the trough impact, the decline in GDP as a result of the oil price shock. And the same three measures of the importance of oil. Once again, all the lines slope downwards, but now the influence of oil through indirect channels, both on aggregate activity and on consumption, have a closer fit than the direct consumption weight. So it's your overall production structure that affects how much changes in oil prices affect output. And again, when we break it down by exporters and importers, we get a closer fit in both cases, and the importers have a larger output decline than the exporters. Okay, we can do the same with core inflation. The last thing I want to present is something on monetary policy. I can do this in 5 minutes. We're going to consider three alternative monetary policy rules. One that completely stabilizes headline inflation, one that completely stabilizes core, so non-oil inflation, and one that stabilizes the output gap. This looks like the three exercises that I showed in the small model before. Here I have the median responses across countries. What I really want to highlight is the differences between oil exporters and oil importers. So in this graph, I have the effect on inflation, the peak effect on inflation, if you stabilize the output gap for oil exporters in blue and oil importers in red. And the black line there is the median across the oil exporters, and this is like the 75-25 and the complete distribution. Key thing, oil exporters, stabilizing the output gap is less inflationary for oil exporters than oil importers. The import bar and whiskers is above the export one. Now, how do you achieve that? Well, one thinking might be that, well, maybe you need differences in interest rates to achieve this outcome. It turns out that's not the case. So here I've plotted the interest rate response for the same group of countries. And you can see there's variation across countries. So sometimes you need a large interest rate increase, sometimes a small one, but across importers and exporters, it's about the same. Where the difference comes is in the exchange rate response, which I've plotted here. Here, an increase is an appreciation of the exchange rate. And you can see that for oil exporters, the exchange rate appreciates much more than for oil importers. In fact, for most oil importers, the exchange rate depreciates. Final slide. What is the intuition for these results? Changes in oil prices, if they're temporary, have two effects. One is a substitution effect. Potential output has fallen, but consumers want a smooth consumption over time. So you've got this kind of gap between demand and supply temporarily that has to be closed. The second is an income effect. Higher oil prices represent a transfer of income from oil importers to oil exporters that households will want to smooth over time. The thing to note is that this intertemporal substitution effect applies to everyone. It applies to importers and it applies to exporters. Potential output has fallen everywhere. The interest rate is really about substituting into temporally. So the interest rate has to move in oil importers and in oil exporters to align supply with aggregate demand. Whereas the exchange rate is really about adjusting relative income between countries. And that's where the difference between exporters and importers comes from. So that's why the interest rate movements are similar between exporters and importers, but different across countries, depending mainly upon their consumption and production structure, whereas the exchange rate is the big difference between importers and exporters. But because the exchange rate directly affects consumer prices, it's the thing that lessens the trade-off for oil exporters. So let me stop there. And thank you very much for listening, for taking the time, for the questions, and I'm happy to take any other questions. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Just a quick two questions. So I think the first one, we are well into an episode of oil price increase. So how does the model really perform when you compare it to the actual the realization of oil price? And the second one, like, I think it's also the issues of fiscal policy rather than monetary policy. Different countries differ in terms of like their reactions to the oil price increase. A lot of countries have oil subsidies or different levels of emergency oil fund. And like, I would expect that a country that's more exposed to oil price shocks would have higher tendency to do a lot of higher subsidies, for example. And this would definitely dampen all the result that you are presenting. So what's your opinion on taking into account that side to the model?
That's a great point. It's something that we need to look at in the next version. Your two questions are actually very, very similar. So one reason why I'd be hesitant at this stage to just take what we've done to the data is exactly as you say, countries have very different policy responses, not only monetary to the thing, and the fiscal one is key. I mean, some have subsidized oil or caps on oil, or oil prices don't respond as much. So some they respond much more. Where, for comparability across countries, assuming there's none of that, but in reality, that's going to affect the data responses. So to take this seriously to the data, we'd have to account for that. And then, yeah, I mean, a logical extension would also be to explicitly think about the fiscal policy responses and how that affects the trade-offs here as well. So yeah, great question, but we haven't done it yet.
I think I have very similar question, but in addition to like the policies on subsidizing for the oil, like I don't know whether there's any chance like to incorporate like the fact that different country they also have like adopted different rate of like energy transition, like the fact that they more and more reliant like less and less on like the fossil fuel and oil.
That's a great question. Let me just take 1 minute to explain this slide that I didn't have time to go through. So the place that shows up in the model is in the utility sector, because the utility sector is, amongst other things, your electricity production. I know there's more than just electricity, it's in automobiles and so on as well, but that's kind of a key one. This graph shows the distribution across countries and how utilities prices respond to the oil price shock. And you can see that that's the sector where there's the most variation across countries. And that essentially comes from the fact that some countries are more exposed to oil and gas in electricity production and things related to that than others. So in a sense, we're accounting for that in the model. There's a little bit in the transport industry as well, if you've got a lot of electric vehicles and so on. The one caveat is that's something that's changing really quickly. And input-output tables always lag a little bit. So this is, for example, an input-output table from 2022. So it's going to be a little bit dated, but to the extent that there's country variation, that we should be accounting for that. Yep. And so I'm aware that we've gone over time and some people may have other meetings. So if people have to leave and go and do other things, I won't be offended.
Yes, and when a standard DSGE model is modified into a multi-sector framework, the number of constraints increase substantially. I think that this create a non-convergent issue in finding a solution similar to what can happen in CGE models.
Yeah, so that's true. The model is very large, and that can create numerical challenges. It can also make it quite slow to solve, but I think we've managed to fix that problem. Where it shows up is in finding the steady state of the model. The model does have a steady state, but it has to be solved numerically. And kind of the larger the model, the more the constraints, exactly as you say, it can be harder to find the steady state. Now, in the code, we have we have essentially a bunch of checks in the codes to make sure that we found it. And for all these 41 countries, we can. Once we found the steady state, we linearize the model. And once it's linearized, then it's fine. Then you can have, it might be computationally intensive to solve, but the system of linear equations is solvable. So the issue comes from finding the steady state, which things can go wrong there, but at least for the countries that we have, where we're not worried about that. Sorry, it's not that we're not worried. We're confident that we have found the right steady state.
Yes, and do you use the log linearization method to solve the model? This method can avoid the problem.
That's right. Well, once it's log linearized, we can have as many sectors as we want. The issue is the model becomes very large, and so you've got kind of large matrices that you're trying to invert. but there's a solution, and if it's linear, basically you can solve it.
Yes,
That's the answer.
comparing to the nonlinear method used in the CGE model is very hard to find a solution when the model is very large scale.
Exactly. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying one shouldn't use nonlinear methods. It depends upon the question that you're trying to answer. And one criticism of what we're doing here is that the linearized solution is accurate within a region of the model steady state. If you're looking at very, very large shocks, and arguably what we've seen with oil prices is a very, very large shock, then the linearized approximation might be missing something. So to be quite concrete, the Strait of Hormuz has been closed for a while. If it remains closed for long enough that the effects of oil is not primarily a price effect, but also a real quantity effect, there are shortages in places and, quantitative restrictions and so on, then maybe our results become a less accurate representation of what's going on. And in that case, a nonlinear solution, may be something one would want to look at.
Yes, and my last question, I noticed that you assume monopolistic competition in the firm's problem. Unlike the many CGE models which assume perfect competition, what is the reason for your choice?
So monopolistic competition allows us to have sticky prices, which creates a rationale it means the monetary policy has some effect. I should say that we allow the degree of competition to vary across industries. So for example, in the oil industry, the Phillips curve is very steep. So implicitly, that's something pretty close to perfect competition. So the change in foreign oil prices translates for a given exchange rate more or less 1-to-1 into domestic oil prices. But that isn't the case for all industries.
Okay, thank you very much, Daniel, for the insightful presentation. Because there's time limits, unfortunately, we have to stop here. But if anyone have any questions, you can talk or discuss with Daniel later. Thank you very much for joining today.